Hello, this is Nate. You can also call me Nathan, but please never call me Nathaniel. And welcome to reviewing every Monster Train card featuring the Hellhorned. I'm doing this as kind of a self-congratulatory series now that we hit 100 subscribers. So appreciate those that have been subscribing. I don't know if you are aware, but the way YouTube works, YouTube partnership requires 1,000 subscribers in order to become a YouTube partner. So if you have not subscribed and you've been watching a lot of the videos, would really appreciate it. If you hit the subscribe button, you also get then informed about when my videos go live if you're interested in that kind of thing. But yeah, thank you to all those who have already subscribed, and let's jump into the video today. So yeah, we're gonna do every single card in Monster Train, starting with Hellhorned, and let's talk about the setup here. So first, the reviews will cover every single card in every single clan. So that includes also the new exile cards, the starter cards. Champions and artifacts will be covered, but they'll be covered within separate videos. So in these ones, we're just going to talk about the starter cards and draft cards. We will review cards in context of standard play. So we're not talking about any mutators or any type of mods or anything like that. This is just pure single player standard play. And the cards aren't going to be reviewed in a vacuum, so not comparing card to card, but rather looking at the main build archetypes and whether these cards fit into that archetype and how strong are they within these archetypes. So how are we going to do ratings? Starting with S. S means that this card is powerful with basically every build. So it doesn't matter what build you're doing, this card will fit and will be powerful. Powerful meaning it is game-changing, game-winning, a core component of the build, regardless of the build. There are not that many S cards, probably 2, maybe even just 1. You might even have an idea about what that is. But maximum 2 cards in the entire Monster Train set of cards that would fit S criteria. A cards are situationally powerful cards, which means that they are powerful in certain builds. But even outside of those main builds where they're powerful, they are typically very strong, meaning that they are still supporting a win condition and helping to carry the deck through the run. Bs are generally strong cards. So this means that it's a card that you're never going to see as like the core component of a build, but in most builds it's going to be strong. Alternatively, it might be a card that is situationally powerful, but in other types of builds it ends up being quite average. So you'll take it. It can provide some minor benefit, but certainly it's not going to be carrying your deck, and it's not going to be like a game-changing or a run-changing card. C cards are generally average cards. So they are cards that don't really, they're not really strong in any build. And in general, across the board, they're okay. You can fill your deck with them, but you're not going to be, it's not going to be like weak. You're not going to feel bad playing it, but it's not going to be something that's going to be pushing your deck to win or pushing a win condition. Alternatively, again, it could be a situationally powerful or strong card that is otherwise weak. Weak in this sense means that it's just barely above a dead weight. So you would almost rather not have this card in your deck. You would get rid of it in this situation. Average cards you might also get rid of, but weak cards are like definite. They are priority removal cards. D is cards that are just across all builds weak. And again, this is talking about common builds. For sure, they could add cards, they could change cards without even changing the card itself. They might adapt with new artifacts, with new champions, with new other things. I mean, there are some cards in here that absolutely became better with the Exile set of champions. That would have been D cards before. Now there may be C or B cards because they go well with the new Exile champions. But currently, in the current set of common builds, it's a generally weak card. Let's talk about then what are common builds for Hellhorned. So let's start with champion-focused builds, starting with the Hornbreaker Prince. So Hornbreaker Prince has 3 main common builds, and they all directly relate to his 3 different upgrade paths. So let's start with my favorite and one of my favorite builds of all classes, the Angriest Prince. Very straightforward build. You take Wrathful Angriest Prince, and you have a lot of rage support. Of course, armor also helps, but the best thing about Wrathful is that he doesn't actually need a lot of armor because he gets armor through his slays. And then, yeah, you get things like any type of rage applicators, armor applicators, deranged brute, anything that's going to really scale that rage damage. Next, you have the Royal Assassin build. So the Royal Assassin build, the Hornbreaker Prince, you take Reaper. Typically, you flex in 1 Brawler to get multi-strike. It's not necessary, but normally you take Brawler as 1 as well. And then you have a heavy tank up front, and you're getting most of your kills very early, scaling your champion so that he's doing a lot of damage, and then the tank is blocking for him because he has such low health totals. You can also, of course, support with extra rage. You can support with armor, but basically the build's rather straightforward. Big tank, Reaper with multi-strike. Then you have the Mad Chopper. This is a heavy brawler build. It's, I think, the most difficult of the 3 to make work. You need a lot of rage to make it work, and you need a heavy tank to make it work. But the Mad Chopper build can work. It is difficult to get scaling very early, but by the end, if you have enough rage support, it ends up being one of the highest damage dealing builds in the game because you have, at the very beginning, 5 multi-strikes, so then you just need some rage to combine with it. It's very similar to doing like a Dante build in that respect. Although I would say Dante is a little bit better than the Mad Chopper Hornbreaker Prince because while the Hornbreaker Prince does have extra armor, his health total is low enough that it's difficult to scale his armor because a lot of the armor, or the best armor scalers actually do damage to your champion. We'll talk about that later. Then we have Shardtail Queen. So Shardtail Queens, typically there are 2 builds that you run. The first, and I think the most consistent, is the Impressive Parade build. It's one of the ones I showcased recently. It's very straightforward. You have a floor with a multi-striker or a sweeper, and then you get all of the imps from the Shardtail Queen, and you use them to buff up that floor with lots of rage and armor. Pretty straightforward. Then on top of that, you want any type of rage increases, rage artifacts, any armor increases, armor artifacts are going to be good. But even without, you're typically fine just with the imps that are created from Shardtail Queen, and then you hope for a Transcend Imp, which just takes the deck over the top. And finally, the final champion one is the Royally Busted build. This one's really difficult to pull off, but it can work. You take Royalty 3 with Shardtail Queen, which ends up actually adding a lot of damage. The biggest problem is that she has quite low health, and you typically need to get some way of adding multi-strike to her or to get trample. One of the biggest problems with this build is killing off backliners, and very early on killing off backliners. So having some way of getting multi-strike or trample very early becomes very important. And then you need tanks, and typically you want endless tanks and chump blockers in front of her so that they can die and come back and die and come back and die and come back, and you can take advantage of all of the royalty buffs. So those are the main champion builds. Looking outside of the champions, there's a couple of other builds you can do. First is the Burn Baby Burn build. It's Hellhorned Stygian. It's the classic, very first major speedrun in the game. It's Inferno plus Spell Weakness. So you take Inferno, you get either Energy Siphon or Urchin Spines, and you don't really play units, and you just try to kill with spells. It's very difficult to pull off at Covenant 25, but it's certainly possible. At earlier Covenants, it's very possible to do, but it's a I would say, unless you're willing to reroll a lot, it's not typically something that you try to do, unless you are willing to reroll, because it's mandatory to get Inferno at the start in order for this build to work. So then you reroll until you get Inferno, and then you get the rest of them. But if you happen to get Inferno as the first starting card in your deck, because Inferno is an uncommon card that absolutely you can try a Burn Baby Burn deck. There's spell weakness is both common and uncommon in Stygian, so really good chances that you find it throughout your run. And then there's the Play the Buffed Consumer of Crowns deck. It's pretty straightforward. You get imps, you get Consumer of Crowns. Typically you have more than one Consumer of Crowns, or you have a heavy tank in front of the Consumer of Crowns. And you play your imps, you play your Consumer of Crowns, and you take benefit. It typically needs multi-strike. Quick also helps. Large Stone, if you're going to be using it as a solo because you need the extra health, can be difficult to win Covenant 25 because of how much health Seraph has. But if you're having multiple of them and you have a tank in front, then it typically works pretty well. And finally, you have the Angriest Floor build. This is where you get overstacked units. You stack up anywhere between 5 to 7 units on a single floor using Ascend. And then typically in the mix, you have 2 or more Branded Warriors who are then granting rage to all the rest as they get Slay triggers. Apart from that, you then have Hellhorned supporting other classes. Typically, that is in the form of rage and armor buffs. So you flex in a Deranged Brute, or you flex in Fledgling Imps or Transcend Imps, anything that's going to add more rage, or then other armor, rage, and armor spells as well. You don't typically flex Hellhorned for its units. And you'll see that in general, I would say Hellhorned has very average units. We'll talk about specifics as we go through the cards. They have pretty good buff spells, though. Certainly better spells than they have units. And the big appeal of the class is the Hornbreaker Prince is one of the better champions. Certainly one of the easiest champions to play for the most part. And I would say the most of the builds here are some of the easiest, or not easiest is the wrong word, they're the simplest, because they have very clear win conditions. You get rage, you get armor, and then you wreck units. Okay, so enough about the background. Let's jump into the cards. We'll start with Hellhorned units, and we'll start with the common units, and we're going to be doing them in order of Ember cost, because that's how they show up in the logbook. Starting with Queen's Impling. So Queen's Impling is the starter Exile Hellhorned card. Its text reads, deal 10 damage to the front enemy unit. It is a 1/1 for 1 Ember. So thinking about this with the different builds, it fits quite well with the Impressive Parade build, especially at the beginning. And it's actually pretty good across a lot of builds. Early on, it falls off very fast. Basically, after your first flying boss, Queen's Implings become not so good, and you'll see that very quickly. Enemies have too much health. The front enemies, 10 damage doesn't really do much. The 1 health chump blocker, there's certainly much better 1 health chump blockers in the game than a Queen's Impling. Even if you get like Endless on it, you just get really sad. So it's one that is quite good at the beginning and then falls off very hard at around ring 4 or 5. But it has some situations where it actually is quite good. Specifically, Transcendent benefits a lot from having a few Queen's Implings effects, because it's a way to burst a front enemy unit or several front enemy units, because they don't happen all at once, they happen sequentially. So if you have, for example, 3 5 health minions in a row, and you play a Transcend Imp, and it has 3 Queen's Impling triggers, it's going to do 10, 10, 10, not 30. So it's quite good, helping with Transcend Imp to clear a lot of units. And that's basically the situation where you want it. So with that, I gave it a grade of C, in that it is pretty average. It's not weak. You don't hate that it's there. Maybe late game, you'll start getting rid of them. But so there are certainly worse units in the game. It's not especially ever powerful. It's certainly not going to be a core part of your deck. All right, let's go to the next one, Fledgling Imp. So Fledgling Imp is a significant improvement over the Queen's Imp. It applies Rage 3 to all friendly units on the same floor, in the same room. It's a 1/1 for 1. Fledgling Imp especially takes benefit from the fact that it affects all of the units on the floor. If it was add rage to the front enemy unit the front friendly unit or the back enemy unit, it would be significantly worse. But the fact that it applies to everybody is really, really good. Of the main imps, it is certainly the only one that is consistently good in all builds as a standalone. There is one other that you can also use as a standalone, but it's not quite as good as the Fledgling Imp, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And it is one of the best units to get Endless on, because then you can stack the rage. So you play your Fledgling Imp at the front, it chump blocks, takes a hit, then it comes back the next turn, you add more rage, it takes another hit, and you can do this several times throughout and stack rage very, very quickly. It benefits from any of the summon artifacts, any of the imp artifacts. I think, as I said, as a standalone, it is the most consistent imp, and certainly has some very, very, very powerful potential if you get things like double summon triggers and Endless on it. So with that, I gave it a grade of B, and I would say it's a generally strong unit. You can add it to almost any build and be okay or happy with it. The only problems you're going to have is if you have too many units on a floor, you don't have capacity for it, then you get kind of sad that you can't play it. But in general, it's a pretty easy flex pick to put into any build, and certainly a core part of several builds. Molting Imp. Molting Imp is Queen's Imp's older brother. It does less damage, but it does AoE, which turns out is much better mid to late game. Certainly better than a Queen's Imp late game, because you do sometimes want to be able to pick off backliners that have 5 health. The problem is that oftentimes backliners don't have 5 health. They have 8 health, or they have 6 health, or they have 10 health. And with those health totals, Queen's Imp can't kill them off or Molting Imp can't kill it off by itself, unless you have the double summon triggers. It's also a great one to add to the Transcend Imp, again, because the triggers happen sequentially. So if you have multiple Molting Imp triggers, then they happen over and over again, not all at once, which can be beneficial in some cases. It's certainly not as beneficial as with the Queen's Imps, but there are some cases where hitting multiple times is actually better. But in general, I would say it falls off similar to Queen's Imp pretty quickly. Not as fast, but still pretty quickly. Certainly is not going to be a staple or core part of your build. The only exception would be if you're doing a Consumer of Crowns build, but then any imp, right? Like, it doesn't matter what imp you take. You just need an imp. You need something with an imp tag. Then all of them are equally as good there. And there are certainly better effects that you want out of your imps. So with that setup, as it not being a core part of any build and isn't really a strong card on its own, give it a grade of C. So it's just a generally average card. You don't hate it. You may even not get rid of it, certainly over other cards that are much worse. But it's certainly, you're not like super excited to get a multi-imp all the time, unless you really, really, really need some AoE and you don't have any other option. All right, next up we have Welder Helper. So Welder Helper, text is on summon, apply 20 armor to the front enemy unit. It is a 1/1 for 1. When you summon him, he will also apply, if he is the front enemy unit or the only unit on a floor, he will apply the 20 armor to himself. So Welder Helper is certainly good. It does have some issues compared to the other imps. It's not great as a chump blocker. Typically what you want is you want Welder Helper to apply it to the unit at the front, your tank, but then you have this weird situation where you have Welder Helper in the middle then of your floor, and it takes up a capacity. So one of the most important things with Welder Helper is how do you get rid of him so that he's not taking up space. It's also why Endless is not typically very good on Welder Helper unless you have a consistent way of killing him off. Can become a problem. You can also, you can use him as a chump blocker, but the main problem with having him as a trump blocker is that he doesn't die to very good damage. Like, it's the 21 health total is not going to save you, and it's oftentimes more annoying than helpful. Certainly there are times when it can be helpful to just have just that amount of health, but it's not typically the health totals you're looking for. You certainly want a lot more. or you want a lot less so you can kill him off. So Welder Helper would be, I would say, equally good to Fledgling Imp if he applied the armor to all units on the floor. He does not. He only applies it to the front enemy unit. But it's still really good. And one of the things that's especially good about Welder Helper, he ends up being one of the main things you want to include in a Transcend Imp. And a Transcend Imp is, we'll talk about Transcend Imp later, but having multiple armor effects in a single imp play becomes very, very powerful. And with Welder Helper, any of the armor buffs, especially the double summon trigger, is going to make it go, it really massively increases the effect that he has. It turns out that 40 armor is significantly better than 20 armor. It's not just double good, it's actually much, much better for several other reasons when you start looking at the ways that builds work. Because the way the armor scales, the way that enemies do damage, it ends up being better than just getting double armor. But anyway, with all of that, it's still certainly better than the Queen's Imp. It's certainly better than the Multi-Imp, and better than some uncommon imps as well. And you can slot it into most decks as long as you have some way of killing him off, or if you don't mind having him take up a capacity. It's really easy to slot him in, and there are some really good applications you can put him. If you get like Burnout on him, so if you have a Melting Remnant as either the primary or secondary clan, and you get Burnout as a starting buff on him, that's a great way to kill him off. If you have, like, if you're going Umbra, you can use Cannibalize to get rid of him. So there's typically in every class a way to get rid of the Welder Helper. Hellhorned has it with Torch and other direct damage spells. But just be mindful of that you need to find a way to kill him off if you want to take the full advantage of him. With that, still give him a grade of B because he is generally strong. You can fit him into most decks. He's not going to be your carry. He's not necessarily your win condition, but you can fit him into every deck and he'll be beneficial. And one thing I should note about all the imps that is a benefit is that they're not priority units. So priority units are units that are uncommon, rare, and are not imps, and at least for Hellhorned. And that means that you won't draw him early on, which is when you don't want to draw him. Actually, you want to draw him mid to later in the runs, after you've already played your units, especially after you've played your tank. That's when you want your Welder Helper. And so the fact that he's not a priority ends up actually being helpful for you as well. Getting into the uncommon units now, starting with Branded Warrior. So Branded Warrior fits really well into that overstacked floor build, because then the idea with the overstacked floor is that you have multiple Branded Warriors and they're each taking effect with their slay triggers. And again, the text is, he starts with Rage 4, so it means he has effective damage on play of 18 without any upgrades. And on slay, he grants 3 Rage to all friendly units. He would be significantly worse. He would be almost D tier if it was apply Rage on himself, unless it was like a lot of Rage, like 6, 7, 8 Rage. But 3 Rage to himself would certainly not justify him. He would be trash tier. So the fact that he applies it to all friendly units is really the main benefit there. It does become a little bit awkward to try to get slay triggers with Branded Warrior. It's fine on that build I mentioned where you're overstacking a floor, because usually you have 2 or more Branded Warriors, so the chance that one of them will get a kill is enough, and as long as one of them does, then all of them take benefit. But as a standalone, it can be awkward. If you're playing him with the Hornbreaker Prince, typically you have this competition because 2 of the Hornbreaker Prince's upgrade paths also want slays, so then you're having to like balance, who do I get my slays with, and that becomes kind of awkward. As well, if you put him in the front, he dies because he has such low health total. But if you put him in the back, sometimes the front units just kill the units, and then he doesn't get any slay triggers. So it can be kind of awkward to figure out how to make him work in a normal, non-overstacked setup. However, in general, you get multi-strike on him, you get him some health, and he's just a generally strong unit anyway, with the upside that he's occasionally gets slay triggers. So at worst, he's average, but he has some real carry potential if you set up the deck and do that kind of overstacked setup, or get him a large stone, get him multi-strike, and then he's going to more consistently get Slay triggers even on a standalone floor, and then you're pretty happy with how he's working. So with that, give him a grade of B. He has some upside, some opportunity to become very powerful, and at worst, he's an average unit. I wouldn't say he's generally strong, though. He's generally average with some powerful upside with the right setup. Horned Warrior. Horned Warrior was one of my favorite units during the beta. He has lost some favor over time as I've gained experience and just kind of awareness of how the game works. He's certainly not the worst Hellhorned unit. He is still very below average. He has no text. So the fact that he's just a pure vanilla unit is one of the reasons why he's not so good. There's nothing to take advantage of there except for his stats. And his stats are not really that great. The one thing that's going for him is that he's a 1 cost, and better statted units in Hellhorned cost more. But that 4 health is really, really, really bad. The 4 health basically makes it mandatory that you add some type of armor, some type of incant armor, some type of health, something to keep him alive. He dies to all sweep units. He dies to most spikes. And if they break through your front line, he dies in 1 hit to any boss in the game. So he's not very good vanilla. It gets better if you get demons have multi-strike. Then he starts getting a little bit better, but that's true of all the demons. And I would say the fact that he has 30 damage to start with is pretty good. It's one of the highest starting damages in the game, but it's not really scalable. And that's the biggest thing with the Horned Warrior. He might be pretty good early to mid game when the damage isn't so high coming in from the enemies and their health totals are quite low. But when you start getting enemies that have 120, 150, 190 health, Horned Warrior is not really going to cut it for you. He can be a filler in an overstacked build, but he's certainly not carrying that build. He's just one thing to put in there when you're trying to get 5 to 7 units on a single floor. So with that, give him a grade of C. Generally average. He's very close to a D. I would say C minus is his effective rating. So one of the worst, but not the worst. We'll talk about the worst in a little bit. Impish Scholar. Impish Scholar is a feast or famine card, and it entirely depends on what consume spells you have in your deck. And why is that? Because his summon trigger is return a random consumed spell into your hand. So a couple things. One, you don't get to pick it. The fact that you can't tutor the consumed spell actually makes a big difference. If you have a lot of consumed spells and one that you want to target, Impish Scholar is not very good. Similarly, if you have a lot of spells that are all average, the best you're going to get is an average result. There are some specific builds that are infinite due to Impish Scholar. Not really due to Impish Scholar, but more often his interaction with Transcend Imp, but still his summon trigger. So that is a thing. You can get infinites with Impish Scholar plus some other spell combinations. But that's super, super rare, and I wouldn't build your deck around it. And then apart from that, what's the best situation for Impish Scholar is if you get a single card that you want to bring back over and over again, something like Furnace Tap or maybe a Wildwood Sap that's like double stacked or some other type of really, really powerful consume card. That's when it's useful. Otherwise, it tends to be pretty mediocre. And given that it's definitely not a core staple of any major Hellhorned build, I put it at a C tier. It is a generally weak card that has some powerful potential in specific situations, but I would also give this more like a C minus. It's certainly one of the worst imps because there is going to be about, I would say the majority of the time, it's going to do nothing. It's going to be a 1-1 for 1, which is very weak. Pyre Chomper. Pyre Chomper was a hard one for me. It is the best of the weaker imps, is what I can say it. So summon trigger is gained for Ember. Certainly better than get a consume card back. It's better than AoE 5 damage, and it's better than do 10 damage to the front enemy unit. It is not as good as grant armor, and it is not as good as grant rage to all of the floor. So it puts it in this weird position where I wasn't sure exactly where it belongs. It's either strong or weak, with very, very rarely it becomes nuts. Specifically, it becomes nuts when you have either an endless Pyre Chomper and you have Ember does not decay, or you have double summon triggers, or you have multiple Pyre Chompers and then a Transcend Imp. Then you get the nuts, and you get insane amounts of Ember that you can dump into an X cost card or any kind of like massively expensive cards with like double stack effects or any whatever, removing consume, and then it gets nuts. But I would say in general, it tends to be very average, which is why it was difficult for me. So I ended up putting it into the B tier, specifically because you do have that high upside potential, and you're never, unless you have a deck that's just super low in Ember cost, you're never like, crap, I got a Pyre Chomper. But you will have occasionally, even with decks that use Pyre Chomper to gain Ember, you will have turns where it's not as useful. But the fact that you can cheat out things like Consumer of Crowns, Shadow Sieges, and get huge return on your X cost cards, or just play more 3 cost cards or more 2 cost cards, or if you can reform him, you can get him for free and then play him to get rid of all the blights in your deck. There are so many like cases where it's useful to have a Pyre Chomper that I kept him in the B tier. But he's also borderline. He's like a B minus. Because there are going to be a lot of situations where he's just not adding a lot of value, especially late game, unless you have really good X cost cards or you're trying to cheat out really expensive units. Railbeater. Railbeater is the worst unit in Hellhorned. And you may wonder why, because he has armor 25, he has health 10, he has 10 damage. It actually seems like decent stats. The reason why Railbeater I find to be pretty bad is he doesn't really fit into any build. If you put him in with like a Hornbreaker Prince build, he's not good enough to tank. And he doesn't do enough damage to really justify putting behind the Hornbreaker Prince. There are certainly better units to hit the back line. And his effect, honestly, turns out it's not super great. The one build where it kind of works is the Assassin build, because then you can knock the tank out of the way and then you use your Prince Assassin to get slay triggers on these middle or backline units. But what you find with a lot of the unit patterns is you have big unit, small unit. So you get rid of the first big unit just to have a second big unit that then you don't kill anyway. And oftentimes, even worse than that, you have big unit that does a lot of damage, medium unit, and you knock the big unit that does a bunch of damage and has a bunch of health to the back. Your big damaging unit then kills a unit with like 5-10 health, and then you have the massive unit at the back that then goes up and kills your pyre. So I find that the fact that you can't really control how his strike is going to work makes him really clunky. And every time I found him doing well, I could literally swap him out for any other unit. I could swap him out for a Horned Warrior, and it would do just as well. So it's a kind of a weird one for me. The one situation where he's actually okay, you can get Endless on him because the armor comes back. So you replay him, he gains the 25 armor again. So you can get 35 health over and over again. But in my experience, just not that great. So for me, I'm not a big fan of Railbeater. I think somehow he needs to be adjusted a little bit. I'm not sure what it needs to be. But I still put him in the C tier because he's still a body. He's still a demon, so he can get multi-strike and start to get better because of the multi-strike. And there are certain situations where, yes, it's good to knock the front unit back to try to get slay triggers on middle units. But in general, I find him to be below average borderline D. He's a very, very bottom C- for me. Steelworker. Steelworker is much better, which again, looking at his stats, you think, how could he be better? Because he has upside. There's a lot of upside with Steelworker. Just as a standalone, if you can have him not take damage for a long time, he'll grow a lot of armor and he'll become fairly tanky. He's certainly not good with Endless, so you want to avoid Endless on him. But yeah, get him stacking armor. You can even combine it with regen because his 15 base health is more than the 10 base health from the Rail Beater, which does make a difference. A lot of units are doing something around 10 health, 15 health, and being able to heal that all the way and then gain the armor on top makes it a lot better. And then if you get any type of armor buffs, they just continue to stack on top of Steelworker. There's also some, there's like Battering Ram. Battering Ram with 5 damage is still 20 damage to a unit. That's more than you'll get out of a Steelworker that's dead or out of any other unit that doesn't have armor, basically. So it tends to be pretty good. It's a decent tank. It's was also a tough one for me. I think it sits right on that in between B and C. I ended up putting it into B only because there are some potential if you get the armor buff where it adds 4 armor every time armor is applied, then you're getting plus 9 armor per turn. That scales pretty quickly. The fact that he scales himself, you can even not have him at the front, you can have him in the middle and he'll just scale up armor for a long time and then be like a secondary tank behind your main tank. There's a lot of good uses of Steelworker that puts him in that B tier. He's certainly not the best of the B tier, but I would say just good enough to make it into the B tier. Alpha Fiend. Alpha Fiend is one where actually he's a pretty good statted unit. And the drawbacks, the fact that he's 2 cost and that he takes up 3 capacity is what hinders him. You make him a 1 cost 3 capacity or a 2 cost 2 capacity and he's suddenly much better. The fact that he takes up so much space and has so low base stats to show for it is what makes it difficult for him. Now, his upside potential is really great, especially during relentless combat. He is, if you have any kind of tank in front of him, he is a boss killer because he's going to continue to hit that boss harder every single time he hits him. It's one of the few strike, I think maybe he's the only one, strike units that's scalable. Most all others have like Resolve or Revenge or something like that. But Strike turns out to be pretty good, especially if you get multi-strike on him. However, due to the clunkiness, I find it really difficult to play him out. Even in builds where he is my carry, it's still difficult to play him out and then be able to do something else immediately to help kind of kickstart the battle. And that for me is why it's difficult. Again, I think just reducing his cost or reducing his capacity would make it tremendously better. Both would be obviously ideal. And the fact that there is another unit that is significantly better than this one, that is 1 cost, is 2 capacity, and has the same base stats, definitely for me, I feel like something could be improved here. But he does have some scale potential. Generally, I find him pretty weak unless you are taking advantage of specifically that scale potential with multi-strikes and you have a solid tank in front of him, and you have a way to get enough Ember to play him out and play a bunch of other stuff. So given all of that criteria to make him good, I put him in the C tier. But he's like a C+. He's almost a B. And if you were to lower his Ember cost or reduce his capacity constraint, he's very easily a B, maybe even a very good B, B+. So his main drawback is simply just like all of the clunkiness of having to play him. Finally, in the uncommon, we have Demon Fiend. Demon Fiend is even clunkier to play than Alpha Fiend because of the extra Ember cost. However, his base stats are so much better. A 50-50 that you play as a 50-50 turns out to be much better than a 10-25 with unlimited scale potential. Certainly, Demon Fiend struggles against late game bosses and especially against Seraph. But all the way up until then, he will be really punching through bosses. struggle to get through him and his heavy damage. You get multi-strike on him. You get even like just extra health on him. Ends up being extremely valuable. You put him behind a tank, and he'll attack through that whole tank's health, and then he has his own 50 health is not nothing to shake at, or nothing to I don't know. It's nothing to write off immediately. It's quite a lot of health, and you get any armor on him, and then he becomes even tankier. Still, the clunkiness becomes an issue, especially if you get him in the first ring or second ring. He ends up being basically a dead card unless you have some type of Ember generation. But then after Daedalus or Talos, you upgrade Ember once, and then you can play him from your opening hand. So it's pretty easy to work around his clunkiness, and his base stats put him all the way up into the B tier. And that's, I guess, another thing you could consider. If you're going back to Alpha Fiend, if Alpha Fiend had better health, I think the damage is fine, but if he had more health, like 35 health, he'd easily be in B tier. So this just shows how important stats are, even over really good text sometimes. Now, first of the rare cards, Deranged Brute. So Deranged Brute's text, Rage on friendly units adds +3 damage per stack. Rage as a base has +2 damage per stack, so it more than doubles the rage on any units on the same floor. Base stats, 1025 for 1. Deranged Brute is a cornerstone of several builds. It's the cornerstone of the Angriest Prince build. It's the cornerstone of the Impressive build, the Impressive Parade build. And it is strong in almost any build you put it in. Deranged Brute by itself means that anytime you add a Rage 7 stone to a unit, that goes from being +14 damage to being +35 damage, which is a huge improvement. And any rage you put on top of it just gets out of control. Easily the strongest unit in Hellhorned, my favorite unit from Hellhorned, and yeah, it's why I don't understand why Alpha Fiend is costed the way that he is when Deranged Brute is so much better and is 1 cost to take up 2 capacity. Find it very interesting. But yeah, easily one of the best units in so many different builds. And this is why he gets the rare grade A in the Hellhorned unit set. The only A, in fact, spoiler, the only A in the Hellhorned set for units. There are some spells that also are grade A's. But yeah, fantastic unit. It's definitely not, it's not an auto pick, because if you don't have any type of rage synergy at all, it's not going to benefit you, of course. It's only benefiting you if it has rage synergies. Otherwise, it's just a 1025, and there are certainly better statted units than a 1025. But any rage at all, suddenly that rage becomes so much stronger. Now, one important note, in case you have this experience, oftentimes you end up putting Deranged Brute kind of not as a tank, but as kind of like a secondary tank on that same floor. When he dies, his effect immediately goes away. So one thing to consider is if you're going to put him in the front, you better make sure he's not dying before you kill the enemy units, because if he does die, all of that extra damage goes away right away. So, all right, let's continue on. Transcend Imp. Transcend Imp has the potential to carry a game. It can single-handedly win you runs. Yeah, the potential for a Transcend Imp is just absolutely nuts. And only gets better if you get things like Endless or Reform. Then he just gets out of control. Double summon triggers, you just win. He is the best unit to add into an Impressive Parade build. He is good anytime you have played any other Rage Imps or Armor Imps. But if you don't have any other of the strongest Imps, if you're only having Queen's Imps or Impish Scholars or things like that, he's pretty bad. He's a 1/1 unit for 1. So the fact that he can be trash tier, you can't put him as an S for sure, because he's not good in every deck. And I would also say that when he's bad, he's really, really bad. With that, he is the closest to an A, B, that there is in the Hellhorn set. He is a B++, because if you're taking Transcend Imp, and by the way, you cannot start with Transcend Imp because he's rare, so you're only picking Transcend Imp unless you are doing an expert challenge or a daily challenge. But if you get Transcend Imp, it's because you picked him, and you only pick Transcend Imp if you can use him, theoretically. And so expectation is you probably already have imps in your deck, but just be aware, if you have him and you don't have the imp support, he's pretty trash tier. So for that, he is, again, he's not quite an A, but he's very, very close. And finally, Consumer of Crowns. Consumer of Crowns is one of those that is a little bit of a newbie trap in that it seems so good because 100 damage is so good. And it is. 100 damage is very, very good, especially if you get multi-strike. The biggest problem with Consumer of Crowns is his health total. 40 health just doesn't survive most of the enemies, especially late game Covenant 25 enemies. So you have to have a really good tank. And he takes up 3 slots, which makes it difficult to get a really good tank unless you're increasing capacity. But even still, he's still a very strong unit. The other main caveat is, of course, you have a massive Ember cost unless you have imps. And if you're playing imps like you should be playing imps, oftentimes that you're wanting your imps to die. And so then you have this weird, I have to keep my imps alive so that I can get Consumer of Crowns out. And by the way, Consumer of Crowns is a priority unit. The imps aren't. So you typically get Consumer of Crowns before you've gotten your imps. Oh, sorry, I actually hit the spacebar there. You get your imps after you get Consumer of Crowns. So then you have to wait a whole cycle to get him into play. But he ends up still, when you can play him, being really strong. But there's a lot of caveats, right? There's a lot of caveats to make him work. The health total, the getting imps out, the fact that he's going to be drawn before the imps, all of that you have to consider. He's also the second best unit to have Sketches of Salvation with. So you can do a Sketches of Salvation build where you have Consumer of Crowns with Quick and Multi-Strike, and you get like 4 of them, and then they just win. That's an auto-win deck. So it has one of the best peaks in terms of what it can do, but there's a lot of hoops you have to jump through to get there. Given all those hoops, it's a B. If you can play him at all, he's always minimum average. Normally he's strong, but there's a lot of caveats, and I think it's important to remember those caveats when you're taking Consumer of Crowns. Certainly, you don't want to take him in a standard run unless you have a very feasible path to playing him. You either have enough imps, you have Ember Generation, or you're right on the edge of having enough Ember Generation. Then you take him. You really should not speculate to take Consumer of Crowns, because there's a lot of times when you get him and you just can't play him when you need him. And having him come in 5 or 6 turns into the round can lose you the battle, because you then aren't killing off those front units with lots of health and they go kill your Pyre before the boss even shows up. Just be aware. But definitely a very good card very good unit when you can play him. All right, enough about units. Let's talk about spells. Let's start with the common spells. Most common spell is Torch. It's common. It's a starter card. It's not very great, but it's not terrible. It's not as good as the Queen's Impling, but there are some good applications for it. So what is a Torch? Torch does 2 damage. It's targeted, which is very important, and it's 1 cost. Main purposes of Torch for most of the run are to pick off backline units. Specifically in the Angriest Prince build, you can also use it to scale the rage on your prince by torching him, getting his wrathful revenge triggers. You can add 10 damage to it to kill off bigger backline units. It's not a great investment, but it's okay if you're in a pinch and need to find a way to kill off backliners. Of course, that means you don't want to play it on your Hornbreaker Prince. You can also make it 0 cost to make it free. But normally you want to get rid of torches. It's one of your priority get rid of cards, by the late game, but certainly early game, it's one of the better starter cards at keeping your Pyre healthy, especially Covenant 25 when you have such low Pyre health at the beginning. It ends up making a big difference with killing off a lot of those 1 health units that will just wreck your Pyre if they make it there. So, or at least they'll enable other units to wreck your Pyre. So given its versatility at the beginning of the game, it's not a D, but it is a C, very low C, and certainly by the end you need to get rid of your torches or, I don't know, have insane amounts of magic power on them before they're very useful and worth keeping. Then you have Vent. Vent is better torch because it hits all of the units on the floor. If you have 1 Ember, and the upscale event is actually really good. You can add a 10 magic damage to a Vent, play it for 0, and it's doing 10 damage AoE for 0. It's a fantastic addition to most of the decks, especially ones that don't have that AoE. It turns out that 10 damage is about that threshold that you need to kill off almost every backliner in the game, which is very good. And even if you don't have it, you can always 3 mana it for 6 and do 6 damage to all enemy units. It goes well with the first Hell Pact. Then you get 6 damage out of it for free. Works well with any other magic damage artifact. And works well with just straight up magic damage stones onto it. And you'll keep it for the whole game if you get a magic damage stone on it. So it's definitely not going to be the staple of any build. It's certainly not going to carry you for the entire run, but it can save you in a pinch, and it typically ends up being pretty good for most of the run. So given that, give it a grade of B. It's a generally strong card to add to your deck. Word to the wise, don't fill your deck with lots of vents. Turns out that X-Cost cards drain all your Ember, and when you have 0 Ember, X-Cost cards don't do anything. So you don't really want to have multiple. You don't want to have tons of X-Cost cards unless you have Ember generation or the first Hell Pact. But especially with vents, having lots of vents is not very good. Having 1 or 2 vents is typically best. Fortify. Apply 5 armor to a target, which is also very important. It's a targeted unit for 0 and does not consume. It's a pretty good card. I mean, it's not amazing. 5 armor certainly isn't going to keep you alive in later game fights. Early game, it's pretty good. Double stacked, it's actually really good. Applying 10 armor for 1 is typically great. You can even then minus the cost, bring it back to 0, and apply 10 armor for 0. It's pretty good. Not the best armor applicator in the game, but I would say generally pretty solid. Fits into the Angriest Prince build. You can get some. You can survive. Keep your prince alive just long enough to get him to start scaling himself with his slay triggers. Works well with any tank, just to keep them a little bit healthier. Works well with low health units that are going to die to sweep. You just add 5 armor to them, and suddenly they're not dying to sweep anymore. Certainly better than healing in that respect. So yeah, it's pretty good. It's not amazing. Certainly not going to win you the game, but you'll be happy that you have it in a lot of builds. And so with that, we give it a grade of B. It's just a generally good card, generally strong card. Certainly better if you double stack it. It's best if you double stack in -1. But yeah, that's basically what you're using it for, just survivability. It turns out Hellhorned can have problems with survivability, so the armor ends up being really helpful. Hidden Passage. Hidden Passage has basically 2 purposes. It is purpose 1, to overstack a floor. That's the main purpose and where you get the most bang for your buck. The second is to manipulate units so that you hit units that you want when you want to. So it's a way to get tanks out of the way of backline units that you want to slay. It's a way to move flying bosses so that you deal damage to flying bosses when they aren't on the floor with all your damage dealers. It's a way to yeet a unit into your pyre if you're worried about it killing one of your own units. It's very good with certain artifacts. Yeah, it's a generally good card. Certainly if you don't have a need to overstack and you don't have a need to move enemies around, it's not very good. But I would say more often than not, you have opportunities to use Hidden Passage in very positive ways. You can move healers up. You can move 0 damage armor units out of the way. There's a lot of really good uses, even if you don't have it as part of a staple. But the fact that it is a staple of several builds, any builds that use overstacking as a mechanic, it tends to be pretty good. So with that, give it a grade of B. So it's, I would say, more on, and it's an average card that becomes above average in specific builds and becomes very powerful in builds where you're overstacking floors. Ritual of Battle. Ritual of Battle was previously C tier because of how much rage it gave you. The buff to it, getting it to 10 rage, actually makes a pretty big difference. The main reason why, and it's with a lot of these buffs, is the more of it you have, the slower that it decays in terms of percentage. So the amount of rage that comes off each time, it's like it decays slower. So having 6 rage going down to 5 rage is actually a bigger difference than going from 11 rage to 10 rage, because typically at that rage you're overkilling units. So let's say you have something like 30 rage. 30 rage overkills units. So going from 30 to 29, you're still overkilling units. But going from like 6 to 5 could be the difference between killing a unit and dying. And that difference you can overcome quite easily with huge rage applicators like Ritual of Battle. Now, it does come at a high cost, but you like double stack it and you minus the cost. You have a 3 cost for 20 is an insane amount of damage. 40 base with the Deranged Brute, 100 base damage. Absolutely nuts. I think it's the best single, it is the best single rage applicator in the whole set. And it works even in builds that do not necessarily rely on rage. You put it with a sweep unit one time, suddenly that sweep unit's killing the whole floor. You put it with any multi-striker, and it's good, even if you don't have any other rage buffs. The rage will stay through most of a relentless fight. So it's just a good addition in general. Definitely a B tier. Before, as I said, I would have put it at a C tier, but since the buff with the Friends and Foes, was it Friends and Foes, or I can't remember which one buffed it to 10, but ever since that buff, definitely in the B tier. Now we're into uncommon, starting with Imp in a Box. So Imp in a Box, it has text consume and add 2 random imps into your hand. So we talked about imps. The average imp is a C+. However, the benefit is typically if you have imp cards in your deck, you want those imp cards. You picked them, you selected them because they fit your deck. Or you got them as starter cards and you're trying to get rid of them later on. Imp in a Box is basically doing starter cards every time you play it. It has some very strong upside potential. So the upside is if you have a Transcend Imp, that's 2 other imp summons that you're going to be able to play. If you have 0 cost imps because you have -2 to all unit costs, then they become free imps, and certainly free imps are better than 1 cost imps. If you have a lot of capacity, you need chump blockers, it's a way to generate 2 chump blockers one time. And if you have consumer move on it, you can just do infinite chump blockers. However, given the fact that in most cases, it ends up being quite weak because in general, the imps by themselves are typically weak, especially if you did not pick and choose them. And the fact that you're going to have 2 imps that then are permanently in your deck if you can't play them right away. That's another thing to consider. If you play the Imp in a Box and then you can't play the imps, those imps then clog your deck. With all those caveats, for me, it tends to be usually pretty weak, but then it has significant upside potential in the right kind of builds, particularly Imp, Oppressive Parade build that's pretty good, or any build that uses Transcend Imp tends to be pretty good. It's also a good way to get Consumer of Crowns out, but I would still put it as a C, that it's a card that can become very powerful or very strong, but it's typically very weak unless you have it in the right build. Important work. This is going to be true of every single card that does Sacrifice Imp. There aren't that many of them. There's the 2. But for both of them, it's going to be the same story. Important work is amazing when you have imps. It is a dead weight when you don't. It's feast or famine. Given that, and given that you can start with it in your deck, it's a C tier. It's a very good card. You gain 2 Ember, draw a card. If you have imps, you take important work. It's one of the best ways to get rid of welder helpers that are stuck in the middle of your floor. But again, if you have important work and you have no other imps or 1 imp, you just want to get rid of the card. It's just not good enough without imps because you can't even play it. Ends up being a dead weight. Rage Serum. Rage Serum for me was also a kind of tough one. The Rage 3, as I mentioned before, 3 Rage is not very good because it goes away so fast. The decay of the Rage going from 3 to 2, 2 to 1 is such big differences because you're losing a higher percentage of damage that now you're getting to the point where you're not even killing low damage minions. It's not super great. However, the fact that it's 0 cost, the fact that it consumes, that you can double stack it, and that you can add it on top of something that already has Rage or kickstart the Rage on a unit tends to all be very good. So for me, at worst, it is an average card. You're never unhappy to play it. It's 0 cost. It does clog up space, so having too many of them can be pretty bad. But just having 1 or 2 of them to like get a quick damage buff onto a unit can be really valuable and can get some of those damage thresholds that you need to kill off units. And again, it's never weak. It's just at worst average. But it does have some upside. You double stack it. You have Rage that does not decay. You have Rage dealing more damage. Suddenly, it's actually a very powerful card. So given that, I put it at a grade of C. So it's average with a tiniest bit of upside potential. But I would still say it's like on the edge. You could also say it's a C plus to B minus. It's very, very close to being a B. Impressive, as I mentioned, Sacrifice Imp. It's going to be the same story. Impressive is not as good as Important Work. However, it has Attuned, which means that you can make it be a lot of damage, or make it deal a lot of damage. And so Attuned means that everything gets times 5. Every magic damage buff you put on it is multiplied by 5. So 1 damage increase of 10. 10 magic damage would increase it by 50 damage, making it 100 damage. And it's a fantastic way to sacrifice imps. If you have lots of imps, you need to get rid of them. You have endless imps you need to get rid of. It's a fantastic way to do that. But if you don't have it, and you have it as a starter card, and you don't have any other imps, it's a dead weight. So given that it is a dead weight, when you can't sacrifice imps, give it a grade of C, but it does have very strong upside potential. Can be really strong if you have a lot of imps in your deck. March of Shields. March of Shields is better than Fortify. Basically it's a double stacked Fortify with the added text, move unit to the front and apply 10 armor. You can use this both offensively and defensively. So you can use it to move your own unit in place to kill a unit. You can use it to move a unit to become a tank, or you can just use it on a front unit that's already there to apply armor. You can also use it to move a backline enemy unit to the front to kill it. Normally, you would only do that during boss relentless phases, but you could do it other places as well. That's a rare occurrence. Normally, you're going to use it on your own because you don't want to apply armor onto enemy units, but there are cases when you would want to move an enemy unit to the front, even giving it 10 armor to do so. And it's going to be always good. It's just an always good card. It's never going to be a core staple of your deck. It doesn't enable any builds, but it's just a good card. It's just a really good card. So given that it's just a good card, it's a grade B. It's strong, generally strong card. I would even say it's like a B plus. Certainly it's not an A because it's not like defining a deck, but it's going to be good in almost any deck. You're rarely going to find it to be very weak. Branding Right. So Branding Right is the best armor applicator in the game because it doesn't consume. It's insanely good with the Angriest Prince build because it also does damage, which then applies Rage. It can pick off enemy units that have 5 or less health, and it can just be used on your tank. And if you combine it with any type of healing at all, it really gets nuts very quickly. It's one of my favorite spells. I think it's one of those that, especially early on, players are scared to take because of the damaging your own units and the piercing. But I think it is one of the best spells. It's almost always good. You're rarely going to have a tank that has less than 5 damage or 5 or less damage. So even playing it once, adding 20 armor, the fact that it's targeted, so it's like a welder helper that you can target where it applies, the fact that you can heal the damage back and then play it again, it's really one of my favorite spells. It's a fantastic defensive spell, one of the best defensive spells in the game. And with that, I give it a grade of A. I think it's always has extremely high potential with specific builds, particularly any build that relies on revenge triggers. So using it even on like Titan Sentry is very good. Using it on your Sentient to draw is very good. So any revenge triggers are going to be good. And then, of course, any other unit, you're just using it to get armor on them. And then in the very rare occurrence, you use it to kill off an enemy. I mean, you do it sometimes. It's not so common, but in general, it's just a very, very good card. Very strong and has really high potential to carry a deck. So, yeah, give it a grade of A. Inflame. So Inflame combines the Rage from... what is it called? I can't think of what it's called. We just barely went over it. The 0 cost 3 Rage applicator that consumes, and it's combined with Fortify. It's slightly better because it does Rage 4, not Rage 3, but it's exactly the same as the Rage on Fortify. And turns out when you combine them, it's very good. Getting armor, even on a backline unit, is good because it protects them from AoE, protects them from spikes. So yeah, I mean, you're going to want to put it on a backline unit that's doing a lot of damage, or a frontline unit that's going to do a lot of damage. You get armor, you get rage. It's one of the best targets for double stack because then you get rage 8 and armor 10, which is really strong. It's also a really good holdover card. So you can get holdover -1, then you have a 1 cost rage 4, armor 5 you're playing every turn, and that stacks really well, really quickly. Generally, really good card. I would say at worst it's average, but normally it's pretty strong. So given that, it's like a B. It's a mid-tier B. Just a generally strong card. No, you're never going to really, like, it's not going to break a deck. It's not going to define, it doesn't define any decks, but it's certainly just a good card to slot into most decks. Tiresome Climb. Tiresome Climb is complicated. It's an Ascend that costs 2, and that 2 cost can make it kind of clunky sometimes. 2 cost spells in Hellhorned tend to be really clunky for some reason. Branded Warrior for some reason, or branding, not Branded Warrior, Branded Warrior. What I'm trying to say is, for some reason, in my experiences, tends to still rather be clunky. It has the same effect as your normal Ascend does, or Hidden Passage does, but the main benefit of Hidden Passage is that you can do it on your own units to get them where you want them. Tiresome Climb on your own units tends to be very bad, and the times when you want to ascend enemy units is more rare. There are some specific circumstances where Tiresome Climb becomes really good. If you get minus cost and holdover on it, you can play it onto flying bosses every single turn and stack all that daze throughout the game or throughout the battle, and then they come down and they have something like 6 or 7 or even more days on them, and that becomes really strong. But that's a pretty specific circumstance. It's certainly not as good when you're doing relentless combat. The other problem with days, stacking days, is then if you get to the point where you're in relentless combat, you can't Tiresome Climb because then it kills that entire floor and moves the boss up. So it tends to be significantly clunkier than Tiresome Climb, or sorry, significantly clunkier than Hidden Passage. And the days to, while it's useful, at the cost of an extra Ember, I don't see it as super valuable. And the fact that it happens on your own units as well also makes it kind of a negative. So for me, it's a worse Hidden Passage. It's a Hidden Passage if you're desperate, or in that specific circumstance where you want to move enemy units around, specifically the flying bosses around, to try to stack days on them. That can be pretty good. But for me, it's more of like a C. I typically, yeah, I just find it really clunky. That 2 cost really makes it hard. If it was 1 cost with the days, you might say, oh, well, it's just a better hidden passage. I don't even think it's a better hidden passage. I think it is a more situational hidden passage with occasional upside. It would definitely be a B tier. It would definitely be equal to hidden passage. It would be equal to hidden passage if it was 1 cost. But it's still clunkier to play on your side with the days included. Battering Ram. There is Battering Ram decks you can do. It is a way to get a flying kill onto bosses. The biggest problem is that it hits the front enemy unit. You don't get to target it, which means typically you need multiple Battering Rams to get through all the way to the back line. And there's this big elephant in the room. You have to have lots of armor. And if you don't have lots of armor, it's a 0 damage card. The fact that it's uncommon means that it can start in your deck, which is pretty bad. It then becomes, for at least the first major part of the game, a dead weight. But it has insane upside potential. If you get anywhere from, 50 plus armor, it's doing a lot of damage. 200 damage to a front enemy unit will kill basically anything. And it's a significant amount of damage to a boss. But again, the biggest problem is making sure you have an armor build. You may not have an armor build, and the fact that this took up one of your starter cards, and there are no starter cards that are that add armor, means that you have a 50% chance of getting, or not even 50% chance. You have a very low chance that you even have an armor card or any armor at all. Kind of makes it super clunky. I think this should be actually moved up to rare if I were to change it. I think having it uncommon, the fact that it can be a starter card, is actually detrimental to it. But it is what it is. Given that it's so clunky and it's very expensive, for me this is a clear C tier. C, because it has major upside, but most of the time it's very weak. If you haven't built your deck around armor, you don't have multiple of them, you don't have ways to kill off the front enemy units to kill, to then do damage to flying bosses, it's kind of bad. So again, good upside, but on average tends to be pretty weak. Inferno. Inferno is also one of my favorite cards. It's certainly, if you're a speedrunner, one of your favorite cards. However, it is very difficult to play. If you're not specifically speedrunning, it is very difficult to play Inferno. It's not often that you have an entire floor free. It's even less often that that entire floor free has units you want to kill. And it is extremely less often that that floor has a boss or any unit that needs to take 100 damage to die. It's kind of a weird card that it is the backbone of the speedrun deck, and certainly there are applications where it's good, but it ends up being so clunky, and for me it's very difficult to take later in the run. It's almost always you start with it and use it, or you don't start with it and you never take it. And given that kind of, again, feast or famine style card here, I'm giving it C tier, which may be very controversial, but I think it has so many bad applications and it has one or two amazing applications. And in all of those amazing applications, it's your starter card. It's very rarely that you're taking it, on 6th, 7th floor and then somehow making it fit into your deck. It's almost always that you start with it and you build your deck around it. So given that, for me, it's a C tier with amazing upside when it does work. Rare cards, starting with the Spike of the Hellhorned, the first of the spikes that we'll cover. Spike of the Hellhorned is one of the worst spikes. At 2 Ember, it is worse than an Inflame. It gives you less armor and equal rage at 2 cost. At 3 cost, it still gives you less armor than an Enrage, and it barely gives you, it gives you just barely more armor than an Enrage, just barely more armor than a 0 cost Fortify. And 6 Rage isn't really like that exciting. It's certainly not as good as 10 Rage that you get from the... what is it called? The 10 Rage cards. I'm sorry, I'm so bad with card names. I know them by what they do. I know them by what they look. I don't know them by their names all the time. So apologize for that. But yeah, so it has amazing scalability, but honestly, you don't really get excited unless you have like more than 8 Ember. And it's not so often that you have more than 8 Ember to play Spike of the Hellhorned. If you're only having 3 Ember, or, if you have like first Hell Pact, then it's okay. But it's unless you specifically have a way to generate insane amounts of Ember. I've always just felt disappointed by what Spike of the Hellhorned brings. It's an awful card to remove Consume on if you don't have massive Ember generation. It's actually okay if you get double stack, because then you can get up to 8 Rage and 8 Armor for a 3 Ember play, which is not so bad. But just like vanilla 3 or 4 Ember cost Spike of the Hellhorned always leaves me wanting. And so for that, I give it a C tier. It has significant upside, but oftentimes it ends up being quite weak, and it's weaker than most of the other applicators, which I find very interesting because with other spikes, and we'll see this later on, the other spikes are just normally better than their complementary cards. So find it very interesting. I think it somehow needs to be adjusted. I don't know if it needs to be like 3x Rage, or 3x Armor, but something needs to change to make it more consistent. Or maybe they're just expecting that due to the massive Ember that you get, most people are playing it with massive amounts of Ember. I don't know. But it's certainly not as thrilling as getting some of the other spikes, even with 3 Ember. Dark Deal. Dark Deal's really good. Yeah, I mean, 7 Rage for 0 is fantastic. The 5 damage you're normally putting on a backliner. You can also do it on your tanks, but normally you're putting it on a backliner. And that ends up scaling really fast. It's fantastic on the Hornbreaker Prince. It's fantastic on the Branded Warrior. It's fantastic on the Deranged Brute. It's fantastic on really most units that you're going to get. Certainly when you start getting like Consumer of Crowns, it's less useful. But like any unit with multi-strike loves Dark Deal. And the fact that it's 0 cost is really what sends it over for me. If this was a 1 cost, I wouldn't put it as high as it is. But given that it's a 0 cost, I give it a grade of A. I think it's a really strong card that has fantastic potential in specific decks. Similar to Branding Right. It's, I think, the best Rage applicator. It's almost as much as, the 10 Rage applicator, but it's 0 cost. And I don't think the drawback of having 5 damage is really that much if you consider. It's also one of the reasons why some of the units I talked about earlier that have such low health become problematic. But I think it's just a fantastic card in general. And it's almost always strong and has fantastic upside potential. Given that, give it a grade of A. Alloy of the Ancients. 1 cost, apply 25 armor and consume. It is the best armor applicator. And you target it, so you get to pick exactly who you want to have it, and then it consumes and gets out of your deck if you don't want it anymore, or you double stack it, and it's 50 armor, or you remove consume, minus the cost, and you have a 1 cost, apply 25 armor whenever you want. I think it's fantastic. It's an improvement for any deck. Any deck is happy to have 25 effective health. It's certainly not amazing in heavy regen builds, but then what you do is you put this on your backline unit, and you put regen onto your frontline unit that has tons of regen. So there are tons of uses for it. I never get disappointed playing Alloy of the Ancients. I think it's just a really, really good card. So similarly, it's an A. It has fantastic upside if you double stack it. If you have this plus a card we'll review in a minute that doubles your armor, them together becomes insanely strong. It's also good because typically what you want is, especially if you're going like Angriest Prince build or some of the other builds, you want a big armor right up front, and then over time you find other ways to sustain. This is that big armor up front that then consumes and goes away. I think it's fantastic. I think if it was 2 cost, it would be low B tier. If it didn't consume, it'd probably stay in A tier. It wouldn't go to S tier though. But I think it's just a really good armor applicator. It's a lot of armor all at once. 25 armor ends up being a huge deal when you're talking about scaling armor. And I think this is the last of the rare spells, is Impalate. So Impalate, very similar to all the other imp-based cards, is very Feast or Famine. If you don't have imps, it does 0 damage. If you have imps, it does not 0 damage. It's fantastic with Imp Parade because you have, not infinite, but you have really, really high scaling. It's really good with Imp in a Box. It's really good with the Imp artifact. But if you don't have any of those things, it's a dead weight. So given that is the dead weight, the one nice thing about this particular dead weight is that you can play it. In some other dead weights you can't. Like you can't play Impressive or Important Work. But you can play this because it doesn't require a target. But yeah, it's the dead weight if you don't get it. Luckily it is rare, so you aren't going to pick it. Sorry, you're not going to get it on your on like your starting cards. You'll draft it, so typically you will already had the imps that you want before you draft it. But given that it's basically a dead weight, if you don't have those imps, I give it a grade of C. But it has pretty good potential. Specifically in the Imp Parade deck or any type of Imp Generation deck, it becomes really strong. Oh, no, that's right. We're not even close to being done. We have a few cards left. What am I talking about? We have Last Stand. Last Stand doubles the rage on all friendly units on that floor. It consumes. It's a 3 cost. Yeah, it's really good. If you get Permafrost on it, you wait till you've played all of your rage out or gotten your rage to a certain threshold. Then you just, boom, double it on all friendly units. And now your floor is doing a lot of damage. It's fantastic in the Angriest Prince build. It's fantastic in the Imp Parade, Impressive Parade build. It's fantastic in the Overstacked Floor build. It's good in any other rage. I mean, even like the Stygian Siren loves having double rage. And this actually comes second, so you get the rage first and then it doubles. It's just a really good rage applicator. But if you don't have rage, it's garbage. But I would say most of the time you're going to have at least some form of rage if you're doing a Hellhorned build or have Hellhorned secondary. And because it's rare, you're only going to take it as a draft. So typically you will know whether you have rage or not. But the upside is so big. Being able to double your rage is fantastic. And as I talked about, those thresholds, right? Going from 10 to 20, going from 20 to 19 and going from 10 to 9 are significantly different in terms of damage numbers. So the reduction and the decay after you've doubled your rage is not nearly as impactful as before you doubled your rage. So with that, I give it a grade of B. It does have some pretty weak situations, but generally it's really strong. And the other caveat is the 3 cost. The 3 cost can be problematic. Sometimes you want to, unless you have like Permafrost on it, if you're waiting to like draw it at the right time, it can be really clunky to play around the 3 Ember cost. And if you haven't scaled your rage like quite early, it's not going to like instantly get you to that point where your units are surviving all the time. So there are some situations, even in those decks where it's very good, where you just draw it at the wrong time and then you don't double at the right time, and now you're sad. And if you remove Consume from it, it's a 4 cost, which makes it difficult to play. So it's a little bit of a weird one. Has insane scalability. At worst, it's average. And typically you're only going to play it and pick it if it's working with your deck. So this is probably, I would say, like a B+, borderline A card, which is going to be interesting because then the next card, Reinforce. Reinforce allows you to double the armor on a targeted unit. Is actually much worse, and it's worse for a couple of reasons. One, it's a targeted unit, so you can't do the whole floor, and the fact that you can't do the whole floor significantly lowers the value of the card. The second is armor can be difficult to stack to the point where doubling it on a single unit ends up being a huge deal. And in those times when it's a huge deal, it ends up being kind of a win more card. It's you were already going to win, and then you play Reinforce, and you're extra winning. There are situations where it ends up coming clutch, and that double armor gets you right to that threshold where you're surviving a relentless fight. But for me, oftentimes, if I'm getting to that point where I have that much armor, like if I have Branding Right usually can scale me enough that I don't need Reinforce. And the only other situations where you want to use it then is to get insane amounts of armor specifically to battering ram a flying boss. And if you're battering ramming a flying boss to kill it, you have a deck that's going to win. And so for me, we're not doing these ratings to get the best score. We're doing these ratings specifically as like consistency in winning your runs. And so for me, Reinforce, it doesn't really do that. It's really it's a win more card. Which is interesting because the last one is not a win more card. The Rage, so we go back to the Rage. Last Stand is not a win more card. It can be a win more card, but getting Rage to certain damage thresholds does make a difference. And the fact that it affects all the friendly units means that you can just play it. And even if you only have like 6 or 7 Rage, going from 6 Rage to 12 Rage, 7 Rage to 14 Rage is huge. If you have 5 armor, 10 armor, 20 armor, doubling that is not such a huge deal. It's quite easy to do with a lot of cards. So then you need something like 100 armor or at least something like 80 armor. And if you have 80 armor and 100 armor, that means you probably have cards that can get you all the way to 150 to 200. So again, for me, it ends up being a win more card. There are situations where it ends up helping a lot, but for me, this makes it a C tier. So it's not a D, it's not worthless, but certainly very like solid C. It's a card that has good upside, otherwise it's very weak. And this is the last card, One Horn's Tome. So One Horn's Tome previously was an A borderline S card. One of the best cards in the game, even at 5 cost. I think it was originally 3 cost though, which was just absolutely nuts. But now it is consume, add fragile, and add multi-strike. Still has amazing upside. Anything that adds multi-strike has amazing upside because the upside is immediately double your damage, but not just double it, apply it twice. And applying it twice is better than doubling it because then you're applying it to multiple units potentially or spreading it out across multiple units. The fragile significantly nerfs the card. It doesn't make it unplayable, but it makes it much more risky to play. And you have to build around the fragile. Given those caveats, it went from SA tier all the way to C tier. So when do you want to play One Horn's Tome? You want to play One Horn's Tome when you have enough ways to get armor or damage shield on a backline minion. That backline minion can do enough damage to basically take advantage of the multi-strike. And you can play it. It's a 5 cost card. That means you have to either get Ember Generation or you have to minus the cost to 3. But if all of those criteria have been met, you can play it, your unit will survive, and it takes advantage of the multi-strike, then it's insane. If you don't meet those caveats, it's a huge risk. It ends up being a dead weight a lot of the time because you can't play it either because of the fragile or because of the Ember cost. And then you're just stuck with a dead weight. And the fact that it can be so bad, for me, puts it as C tier. I think if I were to change it, I would change it back to 3 cost. I think having the fragile is perfectly fine. Having a criteria, make sure that you can keep this unit alive, absolutely fine. And it fits a lot of the Hellhorned with a lot of low health and more armor. But the 5 cost pushes it over the edge for me. I think if you remove it down to 3 cost, it becomes a B+, almost an A. But at 5 cost, it's way too difficult to fulfill all of those different criteria. But again, when you do, it's really strong. So then, let's recap. Starting with S's. I don't know why the S decided not to appear until the end. S, there are no S cards in Hellhorned. Nothing I would say is like a guaranteed across all builds amazing. The only card that ever was there was One Horn's Tome prior to all the nerfs. Under the A tier, we have Deranged Brute, Branding Right, Dark Deal, Alloy of the Ancients. I would pick those cards up in almost every build, and they make almost every build stronger. Under the B tier, these are all of your solid cards. You can fit into most decks as well. Fledgling Imp, Welder Helper, Branded Warrior, Pyre Chomper, Steelworker, and Demon Fiend are your main units. Vent, Fortify, Hidden Passage, Ritual of Battle, March of Shields, Inflame, and Last Stand are your spells. And again, you can slot those into most decks. They're either going to be fantastic in some of the builds, or they're going to be strong in most builds. C tier, we have Queen's Impling, Molting Imp, Horned Warrior, Alpha Fiend, Torch, Imp in a Box, Important Work, Tiresome Climb, Battering Ram, Inferno, Spike of the Hellhorned, Impalate, Reinforce, and One Horn's Tome. So it doesn't mean don't take these cards, but all of these cards, you should have a very specific plan of how you're going to use them and take advantage of them. Otherwise, you should either remove them if they were a starter card or not pick them if they're not a starter card. So you need to have a plan of how you're going to use them throughout the whole game. Otherwise, you should get rid of them or not pick them. So that is my full list. Feel free to destroy me in the comments if you disagree with any of my points. If you like this was helpful for you, if you find this interesting, please like, subscribe, check out my other guides. I have a lot of guides that I've been putting out. I'm going to continue to put out more. I've got 4 more of these to put out, actually 5, because we'll also do neutral cards, and then champion reviews, and then artifact reviews. So got a lot of more content coming. But yeah, if you like this kind of stuff, please let me know, comment, and yeah. With that, again, name's Nate. You can call me Nathan. Please never call me Nathaniel, and I will see you guys in the next video.